Welcome to the Non-Essential Podcast. I'm Steve Gibson.
I'm Ben Matlock.
And I hope you had a good holiday, whatever holidays you celebrate or don't, and good New Year's.
Like it or not, you did have a new year, and
you can't change that, suckers.
Yeah, that ain't a holiday. That's a necessity of the calendar. We have to have them. So we're first episode of 2019. And what's exciting about podcasts is the first episode could always be the last episode. So we'll see what happens. One and done in 2019, maybe.
So if you're new to the Non-Essential Podcast, every week we each bring separate stories. The other never knows what the other's going to talk about. And it could be anything. It can be fact or fiction, history, comedy, whatever. Although we do tend to fall into patterns. Mine this week fits squarely in the pattern of what I like to bring to the show.
Well, I was thinking about that, and 2018, Ben, he wallowed in the muck of humanity, the real just pieces of shit. It seemed like every other week I was bringing up a serial killer or, a cult leader, just some fucking terrible person.
So you guys think you had a good week? Just wait till you learn about this asshole.
Right. And so I thought today, I'd talk about a doctor who he saved many people and lived a I'm fucking with you. I'm actually talking about another serial killer today. Welcome to 2019. It's the same as it was 2 weeks ago.
Ta-da.
So, Johann Jack Unterweger. I always want to pronounce... Anytime there's a W in a German or Austrian name, I always want to pronounce it with a V. And so I don't know if that's actually right. It might be Unterweger, but I'm going with Weger. So he was born in Graz, Austria in 1950. His mother, a barmaid, was rumored to be a prostitute. And while she was pregnant with Jack, she was briefly imprisoned for fraud. And then after he was born, she was arrested again in 1953. At this point, Jack would be sent to live with his grandparents, and he would never learn who his father was, so most of the upbringing was by them. It seems like that is a very common origin story for a lot of serial killers, is a mother linked to prostitution, absent father, and it's weird because you say you look at any serial killer story and it's there's this common thread, but then you have to remember there's tons of people who grew up in similar situations, right, and they didn't fucking turn out this way. So it's really weird the commonalities, but how it doesn't actually create a solid link.
The difference between causality and the other fancy word that I can't... Correlation,
or whatever. I think there's an actual better word. But anyway, so a young Unterweger pretty quickly began to commit petty crimes, and as he got older, those petty crimes escalated to assaults on prostitutes in his area. From the age of 16 to 25, he would be convicted of 16 crimes, most of them being sexual assaults. This kept him in prison for most of the decade of his life.
I would hope so.
Only being in and out of jail for he would only be free for a couple months or maybe weeks at a time before he would do some fucking despicable shit again and get caught. I should mention now, if you are sensitive to sexual violence and stuff or whatever, this is a graphic story. Maybe we'll throw up a timestamp or whatever when you can jump past my bullshit and get to Steve's, and maybe throw that in the episode description. I'm trying to be a little more conscientious about that because, like I said, I just talk about fucking monsters, it feels like.
Yes.
So yeah, he would be in and out for, throughout years. It's kind of interesting that he kept getting kind of ping-ponged in and out of jail when you consider at some point you think a judge would be oh, this is a repeat offender and he's not getting it, so maybe a harsher sentencing might be in order. But it seemed like he would just be in and out until he committed his first murder in 1974. He murdered the 18-year-old German Margaret Schaefer by strangling her with her bra out in the woods. 2 years later, he would be convicted and sentenced to life, confessing that he had envisioned her as his mom, which caused an intense rage that made him just lose his shit. While in jail, the writing bug bit him.
Of course, it always does.
Yeah, most people, this was before blogging, but most murderers probably would jump on that bandwagon today. While in prison, he wrote poems, short stories, plays, and an Austrian best-selling autobiography called Purgatory. He would write some really creepy shit, too, like stuff that for some reason the public was able to detach from his actions. So one time he wrote, "No theme is more poetic than the death of a beautiful woman. There is an age at which a woman must be beautiful in order to be loved, and there is an age in which a woman must be loved in order to be beautiful." Which is so fucking creepy in general, but it's an especially disturbing sentiment coming from a guy who spent most of his life attacking women and ultimately murdering one.
Right.
But people liked his writing a lot, way too much, and he became a very respected writer while behind bars. People were convinced by his autobiography that he was a sensitive man driven mad by an upbringing without a mother or father, and that his talent and introspection demonstrated that he deserved to be free.
Sigh.
That was kind of like when I looked this guy up, I was like, are you fucking for real? Like, just from the titles, like, he was a famous author, but he was also a murderer, and like the logic people have.
I know, and I hate that, because I don't want to minimize it for anybody that, it's easy for me to say that grew up with both parents and whatever, but so I don't want to minimize that, but it's bullshit to be like, well, his parents left him. It's like lots and lots of kids' parents leave him, and they don't fucking murder people.
Right. And really, it's just a lame justification to be like, I really like his books, like it's, that's fine, but he can write them in jail. It doesn't mean he should be free. So thousands in Austria called for his immediate release, claiming his work was proof that art could heal a tortured soul. The public outlook on Austria's justice system seemed to depend on this Unterweger case for these people. Like, for them, it became a big public question of, is our justice system just a tool for vengeance, or do we actively turn a blind eye to rehabilitation? Which, like we just said, that's a compassionate, understandable reflection on something like justice and its place in the world. But maybe rehabilitation should have a higher standard than great book, man.
He words good.
Wow, I couldn't put it down. It's like,
but isn't that how? I mean, even our society in modern, not that this was that far in the past, in the 50s, but in modern America, we almost see, I wouldn't even say almost, we definitely see the same thing, where we kind of have this reluctance to somebody that's like good at what they do, especially if it's to our benefit. An entertainer, celebrities, we see this all the time, where we're willing to like just brush off their flaws. And when I mean flaws, I don't mean minor things. That to somebody else, if our neighbor did it, we'd be like, put that fucker in jail.
Right.
Like,
totally. Like, there's, we see it all the time in like every form, like musicians, comedians, actors who like do horrible shit. And you can just go on Twitter and see like people defending them, but it's like, you're not really defending them in like good faith where you actually believe they're innocent. You just like their work.
Right.
How
could somebody that makes something I like be so bad? It's like, well, as it turns out, they can.
Yeah, and it's like you're saying, like for these people, it's like, oh, we're being vindictive. Like, look at this book. Clearly, he's a better person than we're giving him credit for. But, I wouldn't be able to sit through it, because, like, if you've ever, like, read any sort of writing from a serial killer, they're so up their own ass about everything they say, so I wouldn't be able to actually finish this dude's book. But I am curious, like, how his story plays out. It's like, what could he have written that convinced people that he wasn't a risk to society? Like, this is kind of the story of, like, people, an audience getting duped.
Sure. But they do have a point, too. I mean, I see where they're... I don't want to completely derail your script here, but...
No, it's good.
Like, it is very important in a justice system. What is your point? Is it purely punitive, you know, or do you believe... But maybe pick somebody that's not a, 18-time repeat offender that includes murder.
Yeah. Well...
You might have other people to choose as your mascot, but...
Yeah. Well, you know, luckily... I think the kind of justice system at least tries to get it right here. All these protests and calls for his release don't actually work. They do help, but he didn't get out of jail early necessarily. But because he was apparently just a model prisoner, and in Austria, a minimum term for a life sentence is actually just 15 years. He was released at that 15-year mark because he was a goody boy, and people liked his writing.
He didn't murder any prostitutes in here,
right? But I mean, at the same time, it's this. You know, this was he got caught in 1974 for the murder, so 15 years after that, you're 89, I guess. You know, so at that point, what can your justice system do? It's the guy is doing everything on paper the right way. And it seems like through his writing, there's some sort of introspection and reflection that of what he's done. But really it turned out to all be a big ego play. So he got out, and after his release, he went on a big book tour, doing interviews on various TV and radio shows, and becoming a pretty big star in Austria. And we got a reminder, this is all because he killed a woman. Humans are very weird about the celebrities we'll get behind.
Right. I'm sure the victim's family is really thrilled with, although my guess is based on who he seemed to be targeting. That's one of the reasons that those professions get targeted. There's not always a huge pro-victim contingent out there either.
Yeah, it's one of the fucked up commonalities of serial killers as they go after people without much of a support system.
Right.
So he kind of blows up. He buys a Ford Mustang. He starts rocking designer clothing, and his writing talents quickly secured him consistent work as a journalist and reporter, which included reporting on later murders with such detail and efficiency you could swear he was there when they happened. Because he was. Dun. So his first murder after his release was a Blanka Bokova. She was found floating in the Vitiva River near Prague. Her body, covered in leaves, had a set of gray stockings tied around her neck. Friends had said that they saw her the night before out drinking, and before they left around midnight, they noted that she was talking to a man in his 40s. If only a suspicious guy like that could let us know if he was into killing, almost like if he wrote about it so the police wouldn't have to do this guessing game. A few weeks later, a well-known sex worker in Jack's hometown disappeared. Her body was found several months later in the same shape as Blanka's. A third woman, a Heidi Marie Hammerer, was killed shortly after that, again covered in leaves, and all three were strangled either with a bra or stockings. The fourth victim was somewhat different. She was also a sex worker, but Jack took a different approach, stalking her for a few days and taunting her parents over the phone about how she earned her living. 6 months later, they found her body, again with lingerie around her neck. 4 more prostitutes went missing within the 1 month of each other, all eventually found to be strangled with an article of clothing. Austrian police were certain they were dealing with a serial killer, and if only there was just a popular form of media that discussed a similar crime in clear detail, as if the killer had put his name on it himself. I joke about that, but fortunately one man was reminded of that first murder. It was the 70-year-old retired investigator named August Schenner, who told the police that all the circumstances of these deaths reminded him of a killer he had caught about 20 years ago, a man who had just recently been released relatively named Jack Unterweger. But while police were starting to close in, Jack's writing kept him active and moving. He was hired by an Austrian magazine to write an article on crime in Los Angeles that focused on breaking down the differences in American and Austrian perceptions on prostitution. He would go on ride-alongs with the LAPD and give them insight on catching killers. Obviously, giving Jack an assignment like this was not a great idea knowing what we know now, but even by what they kind of knew then, like, this is a huge whoops of an idea from that magazine.
Right.
It's like a fucking terrible idea. And it proved to be just as bad as it could have been seen on paper. While in LA, staying at the creepy Cecil Hotel, no less, which you talked about once before in episode 11. So if you're curious about another fucked up story from that hotel, you can check that out. Jack would sneak out at night, and ultimately during his stay, he would kill 3 more women. He sexually assaulted them with tree branches and strangled them with bras. At this point, the police had questioned him enough that by the time they had all the evidence they needed, Jack was pretty well aware that they were on to him. So he started this weird fleeing pattern where he was kind of going back and forth through Europe and North America, but refusing to give up his spotlight, as he would just occasionally call the press and the police to explain why he refused to turn himself in. He said,
"Because I don't want to go to jail."
Yeah, pretty much. But instead of just going into hiding, he still needs to, like, be out there in the world, in the public conscience. So he's like, he said, I cannot bear going back into a cell, and this news had already destroyed me socially. There's no sense in me staying in Austria. So it's like he's just trying to stay out of there, not realizing, like, you're also, like, America is after you too. Because, like, Austria's like, hey, you got this guy who just killed 3 of your prostitutes in LA.
Shockingly, it's illegal to kill people over here too.
Right. Jack's feeble attempts to reclaim public support fell on deaf ears this time, but he was still obsessed with his sort of prestige and image, and the FBI would use that against him, convincing him they were reporters from Success magazine, ready to pay $10,000 for his side of the story. Jack took the bait, and instead of entering a room to sit down with a starstruck reporter, he walked into a room filled with U.S. Marshals.
Whoops.
Yep. He was promptly extradited to Austria. He was found guilty on 9 counts of murder out of 11 charges. This time he was given life without parole. Most would probably be willing to bet that his number of victims actually went well above that. But it gets real tricky to just track that down in, like, one area, let alone, like, when the fucker is crossing oceans to do it.
Right.
So it's really hard to say, you know, how many people he actually killed. After he was convicted, he told the court, I will appeal, which was a lie, because that very night he made a rope out of the cord in his tracksuit and the laces on his shoes, tied the knot the same way he did when he murdered his victims, and hung himself.
Darn it.
I wanted another book. Yeah, so kind of a short story today, but I just...
You know, it's interesting because, like you said, you got to the part where, like, he strangled a woman with his bra and said, and I'm sitting here thinking, I bet you that's the guy that stayed at the Cecil Hotel. And
yeah,
it was. So that's an interesting connection. But I remember back when we did that episode, you know, there was a very brief mention of him, not even by name, I don't think, because I don't recognize his name.
If it was like a brief. I think his name was Jack or something.
Right.
Yeah.
But I remember even at the time it being an interesting, like, hey, this guy was convicted of murdering multiple people over there, and then they gave him a job writing about crimes, and he came over here and murdered more people.
Right.
Like,
yeah, it was just really interesting to me. Like, I mean, like I said, like I've probably read and watched way too much serial killer shit in my time as it is, but I always find it interesting, like, the celebrity that builds up around them, you know, and it's like, for me, to me, it's more like, well, it's interesting because it's like the darkest side of human nature personified in these types of people, and seeing, like, just how bad and evil we can really be to each other.
But
there are people who really like latch on, and like there's like fan clubs.
Exactly. There's a difference between, because I think it is an interesting topic, because it tells us a lot about ourselves and like the depths that we can go, and it's worth paying attention to. But that's way the fuck different than worshiping and idolizing.
Yeah, like there are people out there who have favorite serial killers, and that's like, to me, it's like there are stories that are more interesting than others to me, but there's not a favorite. I don't like any of these guys. Like,
well, there's nothing to like about them.
This is like the most reprehensible shit, you know, and it's that type of thing where it's like, you know, by all means, like if when we arrest them, like, you know, if they throw themselves into a passion like writing or whatever, fucking fine. That's, as far as I'm concerned, anything they throw themselves into like that is time they're not hurting someone. But it's like, it's one thing to do that. It's the other thing to be like, oh, but he's so good at writing, you know,
he can't possibly be bad.
He must have turned a corner. And it's like, that's not proof of
it's
that.
Like the Simpsons episode, for anybody that's a fan of the show like me, where Sideshow Bob, it's after he tried to murder Bart and was in jail, and he's going to his parole hearing, and one of the pieces of evidence that the whoever that they're trying to keep him in jail bring out is a note written in blood that says "Die Bart Die," and he says, "Well, that's German. It stands for thee Bart thee." And you hear the panel go like, "Oh, nobody that speaks German could be evil," and it's kind of a joke, but it's kind of the same. I mean, that's a joke on multiple levels there,
Yeah.
but the same thing where it's like, oh, well, this guy's educated, he can't be bad, and it's like I said, it's gross, but we do that as a society. If you get some, I was listening, I couldn't even begin to tell you the guy's name, but there was a crime podcast I was listening to, and it wasn't a serial killer. It was a guy that had hired somebody to kill his wife, and I can't remember if kids or whatever. And it, you know, that always boils down to insurance money and that kind of shit. But the guy that it ultimately got pinned on was a uneducated, like just a, basically like a janitor, you know, somebody that worked with his hands, but he could barely like write a sentence down, and people were so willing to throw him in jail forever. And then when it came out that, wait, the husband was behind this, but he was a very well-known member of the community and had money and success. And then people were like, well, he couldn't have done it. It's like, yeah.
He makes me use words like community in a sentence. How could he be evil? Like, yeah, like, and that's the thing. Like, we see somebody, it's like, oh, he's good at some sort of art form, and then is a model prisoner. And that's kind of the tricky thing. Like, there's no solid answer, but it's like, okay, clearly that doesn't mean you're rehabilitated.
No,
but how do you judge that, you know?
That's something else I wanted to bring up, because it's easy to listen to the story through the modern lens, you know, where at least over here in America, we've got, what is it, Megan's Law or whatever now, about, you know, sex offenders that have to notify authorities and neighbors and stuff. And there's arguments, you know, I don't want to go into whether, you know, whatever, but we also have the internet, and the news networks are different. It's a lot easier to keep track if a killer gets released and then similar killers start to happen, or killings start to happen. I think we've got better infrastructure in place, but it's still not perfect.
Yeah.
But you got to think back in the 80s and early 90s, it seems like, well, how could these idiot authorities, like, he gets let out and then all these murders start to happen similar to it? Well, it wasn't necessarily immediately apparent that, you know.
Well, it's also, you know, probably back then, and honestly, we probably don't dive into it as much as we should now when looking at, like, you know, kind of modern criminals and offenders. But especially back then, we weren't thinking about the mental side of this stuff as much. So it's like, you know, you're looking at Jack and you're saying like, oh, he's better, but why do you know he's actually better? Because you read his book where he says he's better? Like,
right.
And that's how you're like making a lot of your judgment calls, and like, oh, he's behaving like a nice boy in jail and he's cleaning up after himself and shit. And it's like, but are you actually like having experts like talk to him and like really kind of break down, like, you know, is he just putting up a front? Like, you know,
exactly. Because it is unusual for a serial killer to admit that killing is wrong, because that's, you study this, and most of them, that's part of the problem, is that they have that, it's broken in it, where they don't necessarily feel it's wrong. They don't have that moral sense that it's wrong. They know society doesn't want them to do it, but they don't feel like personally they did anything wrong. And so if they say that, they're probably like, oh, well, see, he realizes it was a one-time thing. And
yeah.
But it's easy to say. Anybody can say anything they want.
Yeah, there are degrees of, like, serial killers who are like, there's the ones who are like, yeah, I did this. There's something fucking wrong with me. Like, historically, they'll be like, don't let me out. Because if I go out, I will do it again. I don't have any control over myself. But then there are more, like, Jack was a more conniving kind of guy. And so he would totally tell society what they wanted to hear from him if it meant he could get back out. And that's kind of what ended up happening, unfortunately. And I also think, now we kind of know more about, like, sex crimes and sex murders. Now we would take into account, like, how are you killing these women? Like, you're strangling them with the lingerie or whatever. Like, this is a very vicious, brutal murder. Like, this isn't, any murder is brutal, but, like, this is a very, like, personal. Like, power-based
especially when
thing.
You repeat the same method over and over again. It wasn't like it's obviously something premeditated and has a meaning to you. It's not like a opportunistic type killing, but
yeah, it's fucked up to say, to, like, break it down like that, but it's like, there is, to me, there is, like, probably, I don't want to say there's less of a chance of rehabilitation, because I'm not qualified to say that, but you look at somebody like the son of Sam, who murdered people by just shooting them, and compare it to somebody like this, who really, like, took, like, articles of clothing and was strangling women. And it seems like, one is a little more detached, and one, like, it's less about, like, that personal confrontation, and it's more about, like, committing the murder, compared to, like, somebody, who, like, wants the victim to suffer.
So what I'm hearing is, don't ban guns, but ban bras.
Yeah, but burn those bras, because they're a potential murder weapon.
Right.
Yeah, and not to say Son of Sam wasn't a horrible, horrible human being. It's interesting to me, like, the level of degrees of, like, fucking monsters out there.
Good stuff to start the year.
Yeah, I hope that let's get going on the right foot.
Yeah. If you're a potential parent out there, the lesson is, don't abandon your kid. They will kill prostitutes with lingerie. I think that's what I got.
I'm gonna do everything I can before your kid is born to, like, just make you terrified of, like, the world you're bringing them into.
Oh, don't worry. That the world itself is doing a good enough job of that. But
yeah.
So I've told a lot of stories on this show about con men. I've also covered a handful of less than successful explorers. So this week I thought I'd kind of cover both things with a single person.
So it's a guy who's like, I'm going to go on an expedition, and then he just goes to, like, Carl's Jr. And
yeah.
All right.
Which, that's a hell of a good expedition, if you ask me.
Yeah, I mean, climb Burger Mountain.
George Melville Boynton was born in 1869. He was raised and educated in the Boston area, and then went to work with his father in New York. It didn't specify New York City or New York State, just New York somewhere. But when he was 20, George had a violent disagreement with his father and decided to strike out on his own. Seeking adventure, George left for Rio de Janeiro aboard a fruit ship, which I'm sad to report is just a ship carrying fruit and not a ship made out of fruit.
It's the banana boat.
Get on the boat. George would return to the United States 8 years later. George claimed to have worked as a soldier of fortune while overseas. Decades after his return, bolster those claims, going on to say he served as a military advisor to some of Central and South America's great revolutionary leaders throughout Cuba, Peru, Colombia, Mexico, and Manchuria. But upon his return to the United States, George settled in San Francisco, though he wouldn't be there long before his greatest adventure would start. Apparently, George made a bet with a wealthy friend or friends. Some stories say it was the mayor. Nobody really knows who he made a bet with, just that they were wealthy. But the bet was that he could travel around the world on foot without spending a single dime, basically just relying on the kindness of strangers, like the streetcar named Desire or whatever.
That would have to be so much money to get me to even, like, to get me to go to, like, another town on foot.
Right. Well, according to the terms of the bet, if George could complete his journey within a 5-year period, they were going to say walk around the world, but just, when you get to it, you got to do it within 5 years. But if he did that, he would get $50,000. And, we're talking 1890s here, so that's a hell of a lot of money. But George took the challenge one step further and decided that traveling around the world without spending any money also meant that he would begin his journey without any equipment or even clothing.
So it's like one of those Survivor Man type shows. Like you get
exactly like
dropped into a spot without any shit.
Naked and Afraid, San Francisco. Which I think...
but you can't get like dropped out of a helicopter, so you just run out of your house naked.
Ta-da!
I gotta get around the world.
Yeah, it's funny because I always do like wonder about this stuff when you're reading this. It's like, okay, so his bet started. Like, how did it literally exactly start? Did he, like you said, he must have just like jumped out the front door.
You shake on it, and then that guy goes 3, 2, 1, go.
Go.
Like,
so the first thing that the apparently completely nude George Boynton did was fashion a suit of clothes from some discarded paper bags. However, before he even made it out of the city, a tailor took pity on him and gave him some clothes and equipment, including like a knapsack, traveling gear. Still, George thought his paper suit was pretty clever, and interviews often exaggerated the amount of time he spent wearing the suit. In fact, there are a lot of headlines said, man's traveling around world on foot in paper suit, which he apparently made it like 3 blocks in a paper suit, but whatever.
That was the real bet. Can you make it around in that paper suit?
Paper suit. During an interview with a paper in London, he even recreated the suit and put it on for a photo session. So you can find these 100-plus-year-old photos of this guy in a paper suit. And I will say, shockingly, looks like a pretty fucking well-made paper bag suit. Like, if it was me, I would literally just pull a paper bag up over my waist and, stick my 2 legs through it like in the cartoons.
I'd put like a paper bag over my head, draw a smiley face on it, and then like, well, yeah, I'd probably be arrested because that's about as far as I would go, and I would still be naked,
So 6 months after he left San Francisco, George actually arrived in New York City. He had successfully walked the 4,000-plus miles that comprised the first leg of his journey, which included, going through deserts and mountainous areas and all that good stuff between San Francisco and New York. From New York, he would take a ship to London because you can't walk across the ocean.
Well, then bet's voided.
Void, go home. There he would give interviews, and that's where he would launch his European leg of the expedition. Apparently, his plan was to hit every major European capital, which is both weird to me and vague.
And also showing off.
But yeah, like if your trip's around the world, if it's me, I'm not going to do it. But if I had to do it, I'm going to pick like the straightest fucking line possible. And if you know geography even a little tiny bit, if you're going to say I'm going to hit every capital in Europe, every major capital, that is not a straight fucking line.
That's pretty
going all over the damn
like
place.
They actually plan out European trips by train for people who want to do things like that, and it's no matter how you do it, it's very like loopy and fucking
right.
It's
because there's no way to draw a straight line from like England to
and that's we don't hold Europe accountable enough for that. What the fuck? Put it all in a straight line for
straight
us.
line, make it easy, damn it. So anyway, he would go through every major European capital before heading through Siberia, because that's what you want to do on foot, then to Japan, where he'd cross the Pacific heading back to San Francisco. But once he made it back to San Francisco, he would then walk back across the United States for some reason, where he'd finish in Washington, D.C. Like, my bet if it's around the world when I return to the place I left, that's done. Like, I'm not adding another trip across.
Double or nothing.
Upon leaving London in April, George decided to head for Lisbon, Spain, which was a really interesting decision given that the United States and Spain had gone to war 3 months prior to that. So out of all the European cities he could visit, his first stop is the one that we're at war with. Yeah. So he made his way across Portugal, and he arrived at the Spanish border on August 22nd. But by sheer dumb coincidence, the war between the U.S. and Spain had ended with a peace treaty that was signed the day prior to that, on August 21st. So I guess it worked out.
We were brought together by a man in a paper bag.
However, Spanish officials at the border would not let George cross. The National Geographic article, which I'll link in my sources this week, pointed out that a transient and apparently penniless and completely fucking crazy American traveling the countryside on foot probably looked pretty suspicious the day after ending a war with America.
What if the official, though, was just like, it wasn't even paranoia. It was just like, no, your thing is stupid. This is stupid. You can't come in.
This is dumb and you smell bad. Go away.
You're not bringing stupid into my country.
Despite his inability to legally cross into Spain, George refused to reroute. Instead, he decided to wait for the cover of darkness and then belly crawl across the border. His plan was working great until he was spotted by a Spanish soldier who promptly opened fire on him.
So I know he's not actually wearing the paper bag, but this is straight up Metal Gear Solid shit.
Maybe he needed to be in the paper bag. The guard would have been like, oh, just a paper bag.
Or a cardboard box. Or drop some pornography down. Distract a guard.
But nope, he was spotted halfway across his crawl, and soldier opened fire. Fortunately for George, and more so for our podcast, he was able to scramble into the tree line where he was actually able to make an escape.
This is like, what's his face? The guy who made the Grand Budapest Hotel, Wes Anderson, I think. This sounds like a fucking movie from him. Like just some fucking weird dude. I didn't put
that together, but it does. And at the very end, they'll get to a part that really, really is going to fit that theme. So now I'm going to be picturing that for the rest of the show, too. That's a great observation.
I'm actually a little disappointed that he hasn't made that movie yet.
So he got away from the soldiers at the border, but his trip through Spain would not go much better, partly because he insisted on making his journey while wearing the American flag scarf he'd been gifted during the first leg of his journey. Apparently some woman gave him an American flag scarf. So people of Spain, having just ended a war with the U.S., tended to not like seeing some weird homeless guy walking across their countryside wearing an American flag.
Going, woo, America.
Yeah, fuck Spain, go America, USA.
Even though it was a treaty, we still perceive it as you surrendered. Ha!
So on more than one occasion, George was shot at and run out of town by mobs. He was arrested and accused of being a spy on a handful of occasions, but apparently always let go.
It's a good spy, someone walking around with a big fucking American flag on him.
Yeah. They'll never notice.
They'll never know my loyalties.
Eventually, George did make it to the Pyrenees Mountains, which border, France. And on New Year's Day in 1889, skipped 100 years.
For 100 years, he's been walking in Spain.
George made his way into France. However, the winter crossing of the Pyrenees Mountains had been so taxing that George was forced to purchase food and supplies in order to avoid starvation.
Oh, man. Cop out.
Thus his wager had been lost, and the rest of the trip was canceled.
Fuck.
But that's what's funny is it's pretty damn impressive to make it across the United States, then across like Portugal and Spain on foot, only to be like, fuck it, I need to buy some food.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, and none of this would have happened to begin with if he didn't get fucking cocky and try to hit every European capital.
Right.
Like, if he had planned a route around that, I mean, he probably would have been fucked anyway. But
I was going to say he could have died in the Sahara instead, but whatever.
Yeah.
So George returned to the United States, but his thirst for adventure soon returned. In 1900, he sent a letter to the American Geological Society announcing his intention to journey to the North Pole via airship, so like a hot air balloon. To fund this new expedition, Captain George, a title that he just suddenly started calling himself, vowed to raise $50,000, or as he put it, he would raise $5 from 10,000 people by, again, walking across the United States. He just loved me. He's Forrest Gump, basically.
Yeah.
Except he can't even run. He's just like,
yeah,
I'll walk. I'm taking my time.
I'm going to go on a stroll, you know.
This time, though, he'd travel from Washington to San Francisco, so he'd make it the opposite way. There's a quote from the Kansas City Journal that does a good job capturing the popular opinion of George in that like 1900s style of speaking that we all know and love. It says, "The captain may be destined to be a great man. He thinks he is. He may be a lunatic, and he may be a harmless vagabond. At any rate, he tells an interesting story about himself." So basically, while George seemed to view himself as a fearless explorer and visionary, most of the people around him had a more like circus act. Like, he's crazy, but he's harmless and fun. Like, everybody loved reading about him. He wasn't hurting anything, but he was far from some like renowned explorer that people like looked up to.
Yeah.
So as he traveled west, George was forced to make an extended stop in Colorado after suffering an injury to his knee. But while there, he met a prospector who told him about the untapped mineral wealth of the surrounding area. George was quickly convinced, and he bought up some claims along Hayden Creek. George sent samples of gold from the land's mines to a financier he'd met in London, a Mr. Noah Barnes. And that's one thing, too, throughout the story. I tried to condense the story and keep it briefer than my usual ramblings, although only so much could be done there. But he did apparently have a knack for meeting and like befriending wealthy, successful people.
And making weird bets with them. To be fair, if I had a lot of money, I would totally like encourage people to do these dangerous, dumb things. I would be like, yeah, I'll give you 100,000 if you go across the world on foot.
Right, he's viewing him as peers, but there's probably more like the wealthy assholes from Trading Places. Like, yeah, whatever. So anyway, he sent some samples of gold to this Noah Barnes, and Barnes determined that the gold was of highest quality, and after a number of visits, actually agreed to fund the launch of the Colorado Prospecting, Developing, and Mining Development Company, which is the dumbest fucking name I've ever heard. Like, developing is in there twice, for one.
Well, it was between that and I walked a lot.
Over the next few years, and I mean like one or two, they would fund or found a number of mining companies in the area, and even a mining town that would be named Barnes, Colorado, which boasted over 300 structures, which mean, homes, halls, taverns, whatever.
Yeah.
Stocks in the company sold very well thanks to the high quality of gold that investors discovered upon inspection of the mines. It wasn't long, however, before someone figured out that Barnes was salting the mine, which basically means he would take high-quality ore that they'd get from, like, one of the few mines that were halfway decent. He'd literally load it into his shotgun and blast it into the walls of the rest of the mines in order to make them look like they, too, were profitable. So, for this fraud, Barnes went to jail. And the companies all folded. The town of Barnes, Colorado was abandoned because, a mining town with no mines is no town at all.
And he resolved himself to go to every jail around the world in 5 years.
On foot, in a paper bag. Interestingly, like, I was just curious because I love these things, and Ohio has some too, but I was like, well, this town, they said there's 300 houses. Like, what happened to the town? So I had to specifically look that up, and like it turns out it was abandoned. But then there's like historical record where other towns around the area, citizens just came and literally took the buildings. Like Like there was one account how this guy that owned a ranch nearby took 2 long poles, moved one of the log cabins onto it, and used a team of horses to literally fucking drag the building to his ranch. And that's apparently what happened to basically all the buildings. And I think you can like look up and even find that one that was moved to the ranch was actually rehabbed a few times, and it was torn down just like 15 years ago or so. But I love the idea of these people coming in and just like stealing houses.
Yeah.
Like
there would never be a homeless problem if we just operated that way now.
Right. Like, oh, this property is abandoned. First come, first serve. But you got to take it with you. You can't just move in. George doesn't seem to have been charged with anything, though, and it's unclear how much he knew about the fraud. Given that he would go on to found and sell stocks in various prospecting ventures using seed money from wealthy friends, and they would all fail without producing anything. I imagine he wasn't completely ignorant of what was going on at his Colorado mines, but it seems like there wasn't enough to like link it. He wasn't the mastermind by any means.
Yeah.
And even the other stuff, I don't want to make it sound like he was necessarily outright defrauding people. It turns out a lot of wealthy people that were friends with him were the kind of wealthy people that were not necessarily on the up and up. And so I think a lot of them were using him too for these opportunities to create companies in the hopes of, you know, making some quick cash selling their stocks and whatever.
I feel like you just like one day for George here, like you just wake up one day and you look at yourself and like, what have I become? You know, because it's like I was an adventurer, and now I'm like trapped in this bullshit.
You'll be happy to hear then, in 1907, via a letter to the New York Tribune, Captain George announced his newest expedition to penetrate the darkest interiors of the South American continent.
I'm sure it'll go great. But
he purchased a sloop named the Discovery, and thus the expedition would be called the Discovery Darkest America Expedition. So I think we know who named that Colorado mining. Like I laughed at that because we joke about like our last video game podcast, and this one I like the name we came up for this one, but that took some doing.
Yeah, it took a long time.
In general, I'm terrible at names, but apparently, we're not the worst. George would run a recruitment campaign from his residence at Boston's posh Bellevue Hotel. It was one of the most expensive hotels in Boston, where he'd patrol the lobby wearing a khaki uniform from head to toe. Think Dr. Livingstone, you know, like one of those safari outfits.
Yeah.
Adorned with various medals that nobody knew what the medals were, but there's just a bunch of them on his suit.
I got a medal from every capital I got kicked out of in Europe.
There he annoyed both staff and guests with his legendary lengthy speeches on the virtues of such an expedition, until one day he just disappeared without a trace, leaving behind his growing pile of unpaid bills. I guess without a trace is wrong because there was a trace.
Yeah, there was a paper trail.
He disappeared from Boston. What he did is he snuck out during the middle of the night, knowing he owed the hotel a bunch of money. And he traveled to New York, where he'd continue his recruitment campaign for a very short time before being arrested for attempting to skip out on that hotel bill. Literally, the owner had caught George trying to sneak out with his bags in the middle of the night. So I'm picturing him in his khaki uniform, tiptoeing through the lobby, like...
You're hearing, like, the clangs of, like, metals on his shirt and stuff.
And then the manager jumps out and is like, aha!
I just imagine him waiting by the door for like, you going somewhere?
On an expedition, my good man. During the trial for that, the unpaid bills from Boston came to light, including the fact that he still owed for the khaki uniform and medals he had purchased on credit and never paid for.
He's like, bullshit, I made these out of paper.
In the end, George would spend 3 months doing labor in a New York State penitentiary. After his release, there was an announcement in a St. Petersburg, Florida paper proclaiming the arrival of the Discovery Darkest America Expedition training camp, but nothing more was ever heard from. So it sounds like he tried one last grasp to get people to, like, put money into this expedition, and when nobody showed up to the training camp, it was just done and over.
What if I do it naked? Will you pay me then?
When World War when World War I broke out, George would enlist to serve in the 25th Royal Fusiliers. It was a regiment of recruits largely too old to fight in the conflict itself. They actually got stationed somewhere, I think, on Africa's west coast. But it was a British regiment. But although it was British, it was made up of soldiers from varied backgrounds. This is my favorite part. According to Wikipedia, the 25th included English big game hunters, a British millionaire, several American cowboys, a Scottish lighthouse keeper, a naturalist, a famous photographer, an Arctic explorer, an opera singer, a lion tamer, and a circus clown. And, of course, George.
So the Justice League.
So here's where that whole Wes Anderson thing really fucking kicks in, because now I'm picturing a group of too old to fight soldiers stationed in West Africa, comprised of like a fucking clown and a British millionaire.
Fucking grab bag of backgrounds. And
right. It's like Gilligan's Island, except they blew up the cast by 300% and like went with a worldly, like, whatever. So... Yeah. And I'm glad I looked that up, because the original article didn't say that. It just said he enlisted in this regiment. And I'm like, I'm curious what this regiment was all about. It was about fucking comedy, apparently.
It was a carnival.
Yeah, right. It never really specifically got in, and I'm sure you could find out, but I never got into like what they did. Just, I was good enough to find out who they were. But that's basically the end of the story.
That's why people have wars, is like, just get rid of weird people for a while.
Send them to Africa. But the conflicts in Europe, I don't care.
Yeah, they can help in Africa.
And yes, I do realize that Africa was also involved in World War.
Yeah.
But they were not on the front lines. We'll put it that way.
Yeah, they're like, Africa was involved. These guys were kind of involved. But that's hilarious.
So after the war, he would move back to San Francisco, where he'd live out the rest of his days alone and in obscurity. He died in like his early 60s, so he didn't live a very long life. But that's not completely shocking when he walked around the world so much.
Like,
no, it's not horrible.
You get that. Fuck, if I hit that, I can't complain too much.
So that's the end of George's story. I did have some thoughts post story though, and like I said, I've covered a lot of frauds on this show, and many from the same era as George. In fact, I had to look up a few things to see if they ever met and crossed, and I didn't find any connections to our previous stories. But parts of his stories reminded me of like that whole Napoleon Hill epic, that 3-part
that trilogy.
Shit. But the difference there is by the end of Napoleon's story, well, hell, by like the first like 10th of Napoleon's story, I fucking hated Napoleon. I don't really... There was nothing about George or what he did that made me, like, hate him.
Yeah, it kind of bummed me out that, like, this guy, he never seemed smart, but, like, that trip seemed very... Like, that bet to go around the world was really exciting. And then, like, it almost bummed me out to hear, like, he was becoming a fucking basic kind of, short-sighted con man about shit.
Yeah.
Because it's like, you're better than that, George.
But that makes me wonder, and that's what...
Stop fooling people and fool yourself.
Fool yourself. George. Well, and those parts of the story actually reminded me of your episode talking about San Francisco's Emperor Norton.
Right.
And part of it because they both spent a lot of time in San Francisco, but more so how Norton just decided he's this thing, and it was a thing that people could actually kind of rally around. It was mostly harmless. And he became kind of a mascot, and that's really what George was. Is he was a mascot he wanted to be a serious like explorer, but he was really more of a mascot for the idea of exploration.
Right.
And it's interesting to me that during his most famous journey, the trip around the world, he would fail in France and void the bet. But surely if he was unscrupulous, if he is a fraudster that it was starting to sound like when he got into the mining and the prospecting, you think he could have easily just bought food without anybody having known about it.
Yeah.
So either he was honest, or what I really think it was is that he realized how shitty this trip was, and it was
Tapped
a way
out.
for him to get out of it without just saying I quit. You'd be like, oh, I would have starved to death. I had to. So I'm admitting I couldn't do it, but at the same time, there's this like pity of, you don't want me to starve to death.
I was put in an extreme situation, and
and he was, and for that too. I mean, we can't ignore. I couldn't fucking walk from San Francisco to New York, and that's today. Like, we have like highways that I would just have to walk across.
Yeah.
But so, I mean, his accomplishments weren't nothing. They just
like that's somebody who genuinely wants to do that shit. It just, it didn't work out, and like I said, it does suck when you. I guess it sucks for anyone who has like a big dream like that, and you get knocked back, and then like you have to go into like kind of the realities of society again, and like you're not really sure what you should be doing, and if you're dumb as shit, which he kind of sounds like he was, you kind of turn to like some basic ass bullshit.
Yeah, and that's what nothing I ever read talked about the amount of money he would raise with these various schemes, but it was obviously enough for him to survive on, but he was also obviously never wealthy.
Right.
So it's not like he was defrauding people of billions of dollars and knowing it. I kind of wonder, like I said, he's described a little bit as a fraudster, but I don't know how much he intended to be a fraudster with his prospecting. But at the end of the day, those were his most underhanded years, but it also seemed to be something he didn't enjoy from the onset. You could tell he wanted to be an adventurer, and he certainly enjoyed having fame and limelight, but he never seemed to be driven by wealth.
Yeah. I think that, that's the difference between, like, you compare him to, like, Napoleon Hill or some shit, and it's like, even though Napoleon Hill had a lot of, setbacks and shit, usually divorce being one of them, but there was money, and there was also kind of this, like, we talked about it a lot, like how people even today still try to like prop up his bullshit as something genuine. I think what goes a long way to be like, well, this guy's a little more likable is just the fact, like, well, he didn't really succeed, like it didn't feel like he got away with something. I mean, he got money and shit, but it never really got him what he wanted out of life, and that's
and I just think it's easier to identify with somebody who, Napoleon's motivations were 100% greed. He just wanted to be wealthy,
right?
And that, we tend to, it's weird. We live in a society that tells us that should be our goal. But then when that's somebody's goal, we say they're a greedy asshole and we don't like them. So there's that part. And then this guy, his goal doesn't seem to be that. He just had a dream. He wanted to be this thing, and he was trying to do it. And as a person, that's easier to identify with. Or not easier, but it feels less gross to identify with that.
Like what he fell back into by not quite achieving what he wanted is not something that's so relatable to most people. Like, most of us don't turn to, schemes and cons, but I think there is a universal, we all want to be doing something else, but just the reality of the world sets in, and you have to, like, it's not like a give up on your dreams type message, but it is like there are points in life where you have to put that shit on hold, and like you have to kind of grind out. Like,
I left it out of my notes, but it does bring up, like, when he initially stopped in Colorado and started the mining stuff, he had given statements that he didn't initially abandon his trip to the North Pole. In fact, his plan to use the proceeds from the mining to carry out the trip, and then I think when that fell through, that left him with basically nothing.
Yeah.
And then
so I think that's why I like him. It's kind of like I said, not all of us turn to bullshit when we have to get by, but there is a relatable feeling of like, I'm not doing what I want to be doing type thing, and there's like that kind of message under this. So it's all right, George. You fucked up.
And then if you pull up the picture of him in his paper suit, then you go back to hating him because he's got that 1900, like late 1800s, 1900s, like slick down parted hair, parted down the middle with a handlebar mustache.
I feel like if you're gonna, like, the thing is he's going to like these mining schemes or whatever. I feel like he could have, like, it wouldn't have lasted because people would have been like, what, paper clothing? But if he started some bullshit paper clothing company, that would catch on for a little while.
George's paper suits. They'll get you from San Fran to Spain, but no farther than that.
Only works in specific parts of California where you don't get rain. God damn. That's a character.
Yeah, he's... at least I found somebody likable for a week, or at least kind of likable.
Just, yeah, like I said, I don't even know if it's likable or just relatable. Maybe both. But it works.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we're done. But we're back after a week off. So
yeah, I hope you missed us, and I hope it was a grueling 2 weeks between episodes. But thanks for returning.
It actually, on my end, it really kind of was. Like, I thought I would enjoy the week off a lot more than I did. like for some reason, I don't feel like I'm giving it my all if I'm not doing this show anymore.
Sure. Yeah, it's one of those double-edged swords. It's like, I have to do fucking research, and then you don't do it. You're like, I'm just sitting here not doing anything.
Yeah, it's like, fuck, man. This is so much work. But then the, like, alternative is I'm just, like, trying to do that trick where you flip a pen around your thumb. And it's like, it works once and I fuck up 12 times.
But if you get it down, that makes you a real writer, like a professional writer.
Yeah.
So.
Regardless of my fucking man trapped in a coffin handwriting. But yeah, so we're back. New year. Thank you all for, again, for all the, listening and support we got in 2018. I'm excited to keep doing this show into 2019 for however fucking long we go on with this shit until we get bored.
Forever and ever.
But yeah, we'll be back next week with more topics, more things of interest.
Yep.
Yeah.
See you then.
See you then.